Hello, everyone, and welcome back. So, now that we've discussed global problems, we can start focusing on global solutions. And that is what we'll do in these last two lectures. But before we get started, let us quickly recap what we have said so far. So, last time we said that in a globalized world, we can only address some of our major societal problems, such as climate change, poverty, mass migration, but also pandemics, the current COVID-19 pandemic, by cooperating globally. Now, we've also said that there are two major obstacles to global cooperation. First of all, our evolved social psychology with its innate tribalism. Secondly, the culturally evolved political structures, those social institutions, which are further going to cement those groups. And thus, this prevents us from cooperating over the borders of our political and cultural groups. Now, a first important thing we must realize is that global cooperation will not arise spontaneously, driven by a process of cultural evolution. So unlike last time our society underwent a radical change after the agricultural revolution, in which those groups massively expanded, and cultural solutions to that problem of cooperation within these larger groups emerged, you could say, spontaneously through this process of cultural evolution. Remember, process of external selection. Well, we must realize that such solutions fostering global cooperation will not emerge spontaneously in this new era, in the era of globalization. And the reason for that is the following. Our biological and cultural evolution, was driven by, as I said, competition between groups. So the biological evolution of our social instincts and the cultural evolution of our social institutions, they were both driven by this context of competition between groups. So those kind of features that incited people to cooperate really well within the group, and those cultural features, if you will, cultural structures, social institutions that enhance that cooperation and maintain that cooperation in larger groups, they were selected because they offered an advantage to those groups over other groups. I've been hammering on this point, but it's a very important one. So they got selected because they gave a competitive advantage of certain groups over other groups. Now, this competitive advantage, will logically disappear when we cooperate globally. The advantage is equally spread over all cooperating parties, so there's no comparative advantage to one group over another group. And that is precisely what drives, to a large extent, the cultural evolution of political structures and features. And that is why these features further cement those groups and do not foster cooperation over the borders of the group. And so this means that we cannot just sit by and wait for cultural evolution to adapt to this new kind of context, to this new kind of challenge, which is to cooperate globally in a global era. Does that mean that global cooperation cannot arise at all? Does that mean that we'll always be stuck in this very suboptimal situation in which groups are on a very competitive footing with each other and fail to solve the global cooperation problems that we are faced with today? Well, luckily, this is not the case. We can indeed get to global cooperation, at least global cooperation for these problems which can only be solved at the global level, but we will only be able to do so, I believe, if we consciously, and with we I mean humanity, if we consciously decide to cooperate globally and implement the necessary institutional structures to coordinate this global cooperation. This I believe, is the major challenge of our time, the major challenge of the global era that we've entered. That is to somehow overcome our innate tribalism and make way for durable and efficient global cooperation. Get the proper institutional frameworks to coordinate durable and efficient global cooperation. So how do we get there? Well, I believe we need to work on two important elements. And those are, first of all, we need to create the societal context that incites us to cooperate globally. Global cooperation is only going to emerge if all parties involved are willing to cooperate. And this, as we have seen, is no easy feat when it comes to humans, given our innate tribalism. Secondly, we need to create an efficient global institution that orchestrates and, importantly, also protects global cooperation in our long-term interests. Now, today we're going to talk about this first important element, the societal context that favors the emergence of global cooperation. And next week, we'll tackle the proper institutional framework to orchestrate and protect that cooperation. So what kind of features could we implement in society? What are the elements that drive us to cooperate over the borders of our tribe? Well, I think there are three important pillars there. And we need to work on all three of those. First of all, in order to get humanity to cooperate on a global scale, well, humanity, humans, the current generations must be aware of the presence of global cooperation problems. They must be aware of the fact that some of our important societal challenges can only be solved efficiently when we cooperate globally to overcome these. Secondly, we must create the necessary changes in society to expand what moral philosophers have called the moral circle. Now, intuitively, that moral circle is reserved for the people in our closer environments, people who share our culture, and people who share much of our outlook in life. Now, as I'm going to argue later on, well, there are a number of elements that can incite us to break down these walls and expand our circles, expand this in-group feeling to all of humanity, which would be needed in order to create the will to cooperate globally and to have this global solidarity. And then finally, there must be common knowledge, and I'll explain what I mean with common knowledge. There must be common knowledge of the willingness of all parties involved to cooperate globally. Okay, so let's get started on this. So first of all, we must raise awareness of global cooperation problems. As pointed out, given our tribalistic nature, we won't spontaneously cooperate globally. Now, we're wired, we evolved to cooperate within small homogeneous groups, and human nature has not changed and will not change in the foreseeable future. So in order to transcend that innate tribalism, we must have a good reason, I believe, to do so. We can only be moved to cooperate globally if we perceive the pressing need to do so. Global cooperation, in this sense, is a form of enlightened self-interest. It is in our own long-term interests and that of our descendants to solve these global cooperation problems, and we must be aware of that. The problem, some people argue, often argue, is that people are tribalistic and they should be feeling, empathy and this kind of kinship ties with people from different cultures. But this, I believe, is not really realistic. But it isn't needed for global cooperation. In fact, in a world of completely self-interested people, but people that are perfectly rational, global cooperation would emerge instantaneously because everybody would see that it is in their own long-term interests. So the problem is that we're not always rational, rather than that our empathy, for instance, is limited. The problem is we fall prey to our tribalistic instincts instead of reasoning our way to a better world. So the first major condition for us to get to this enlightened self-interest, to get to the necessary global cooperation in the face of this new societal context, is that we understand the predicament we're in and that we consciously implement the right solutions in order to overcome that predicament. So understanding, awareness of global cooperation problems is a first very important step that should get us there. Secondly, there are ways to expand the moral circle, to make us more prone to cooperate over the borders of our groups, to be to have more solidarity towards people outside of our very close circles. And several factors, can incite us to open our moral circles. I will name three major elements that have, throughout history, shown to open moral circles. And the first is reasoning about morality and society. The second is fostering positive contexts. And then finally, there is feminization of societies. So first major element that incites people to open their moral circles is when they start reasoning and reflecting on morality and on society. Now Peter Singer calls this the escalator effect of reason on morality. According to Singer, when we start reasoning about morality and about our society, the way it's organized, the values it has, we will expand, or we predictably start expanding our moral circle, because reasoning shows us that there's no principal difference between a member of the in-group and a member of the out-group. So there's no reason to treat them differently. And history shows a very strong relation between free thinking in a society, as opposed to dogmatic thinking, and the tolerance of that society towards other groups. We've seen it, for instance, in what is called the Islamic Enlightenment. In the 12th, 13th century, while Europe was very much governed by dogmatic Christianity, in the region of Iraq nowadays, around Baghdad, there was this cultural center of the world, in fact, at that time, where people could freely engage in scientific discovery, philosophy, and interestingly, in that society, not only the wealth of the people went up, which is kind of predictable because there was more science, and so there was more innovation being introduced in the group, which then translates to better living conditions and more wealth within that group, but also those groups, or those people, the group, so the enlightened group, if you will, became more tolerant. In that Islamic scientific center of the world in the 12th, 13th century, Christians and Jews were invited to contribute and to live in that society, something which was not possible back then in the dogmatic Middle Ages. We've also seen it in the European Enlightenment 5 centuries later, in which there were many moral philosophers such as Locke and Kant, who would question the status quo, who would think about inalienable rights of human beings. The first time it was offered that all human beings were equal, regardless of ethnic origin, regardless of religious convictions, and so they paved the way for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They also paved the way for the abolishment of slavery, which followed quickly after their writings. So they really and truly created a strong moral revolution, which led to an enormous wave of moral progress. If we compare Europe in the 15th century, where slavery was an institutional reality where women were being burned at stake because they were alleged witches, to our time today, where we have, as I said, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where all people, regardless of their gender or sex, are considered equally. Well, I think it is safe to say that we've made tremendous moral progress. And that moral progress that didn't come because human nature got suddenly nicer, or psychological nature did not change, or social emotions were the same, and they will still be the same in the foreseeable future. But what changed is that we started reflecting on society, that we started reflecting on morality, and on the moral norms or the norms governing our society. And so this is very much as well what we need in order to get out of our intuitive in-group circle and start broadening our moral circle to engulf all of humanity. This is what Peter Singer calls the escalator effect of reason on morality. When you start reasoning on moral issues, we get to moral norms and behaviors that are pretty far removed than our intuitive morals, if you will, than our intuitive social kind of instincts would determine. Now, very interesting research by Joshua Green, the man you read the first text of. Remember the text of those two tribes and so forth. Well, that comes out of this very interesting book, which, if you're interested, I hope you will read in its entirety, by Joshua Green, in which he develops what he calls dual process moral reasoning. Now, and Joshua Green, interesting background. He's a neuroscientist, so he studies brains, but he's also a philosopher. And so what he did is he gave people a bunch of moral dilemma, and while they were thinking about this moral dilemma and trying to give an answer to those moral dilemma, he was scanning their brains. And so he saw that there were basically two very different areas of the brain involved in what you could say moral evaluation, thinking about moral issues. Now, the first one is what he calls the automatic setting. It's our intuitive brain, which will quickly and immediately yield a certain kind of response. It's driven by emotions and, as I said, by this kind of moral intuitions, and it's thoroughly tribalistic in nature. That we've covered why it evolved and so forth. But he also sees that there's this kind of manual setting, that's the way he calls it, which is involved in making moral evaluation. And this manual setting in a completely different area of the brain is reflective. So it is only engaged when we start consciously reasoning about these moral issues. And in some cases, it is able to override our automatic setting when solicited. So we can override, in the context of what we're talking about now, or tribalistic kind of output, which is immediate and not under our control, by consciously reflecting about it and coming to better moral evaluations or moral decisions. But that manual setting, well, is also, you could say, a lazy setting. And it will only be activated when we consciously start reasoning about certain moral problems. And this is typically not what we tend to do. We will only do so, and we will only engage in this moral reasoning if we are in the habit of doing so, if we have trained our brain in a certain way to do so. So there's a very important role of education there. In order for us to use our manual setting to reflect on morality and societal issues, we must have some kind of education that gives us the tools, the means to do so, and also creates the habit to do so. So we must be trained in these kind of social sciences, think about these social issues, very much actually study what you are all studying now. Perhaps an interesting point on this, on the point of education and tribalism, because that's a point that has often been offered. And there's this typical counter example to saying, well, education protects, for instance, against violent sectarianism and so forth. And the interesting counter example is that the people involved in 9/11, in the 9/11 terrorist attacks, that they were all very highly educated. And I think even 60 or 70% of those people, and they all had university degrees or at least higher education degrees. And I think more than half, I can be wrong, but I remember it's pretty impressive, the number, more than half of those people actually had an education in Europe, which is, of course, quite puzzling, since they were educated in a Western society, and then they would, attack a Western society in their terrorist attacks. And so it is often said, well, education clearly does not protect against, this these extremely hostile sectarian ideologies, religious extremism, and so forth. Now, interestingly, while they all had university degrees, none of those terrorists had any kind of university or even, high school high school education about reasoning about society. And so there was none with a degree in the social sciences. All of their degrees and their educational profiles were purely in very technical kind of applied scientific skills. Now, obviously, this will very well train your brain and so forth, but it will not make you more tolerant. What is needed here is, as Singer puts it, a kind of reflection on morality and on society. So this is the typical ingredient that is lacking often in people who fall for tribalistic ideologies. And I could extend that from religious extremism also to extreme right populist ideologies we see in European societies. Another important element, of course, is having positive contacts. Now, I don't think anybody here will be surprised when I say that one of the major robust findings in social psychology is that when members of different groups have positive contacts with each other, enter in positive contacts with each other, well, suspicion, hostility often dissipates between these individuals from different groups, and also the kind of prejudices an individual has about people belonging to other groups start to wane and start to disappear. Now, in a globalized context, people from different cultural backgrounds come into contact with one another at an ever increasing rate. But it is a double-edged sword. If these contacts are indeed positive contacts in an open atmosphere, well, then it does lead to extending moral circles, breaking down walls between those groups. But when those contacts are forced contacts, in an atmosphere of tension and hostility, it does actually exactly the opposite. Good example of that is the US, the United States, after the segregation ended in, I believe, end of the 50s, the 60s. Segregation was in the end of 50s, 60s, and then ended towards the end of the 60s, I believe. Now, so when black students were first admitted to white universities, well, contrary to what one expected, in that first decade, the tensions between white and black groups of students did not dissipate, they did not decrease. Actually, hostility was ramped up and racism shot through the roof in that first decade. Now, the reason for that was that there was still too much hostility and tension, and the contacts were perceived as being completely forced contacts, so it actually enhanced hostility in between both groups. It is only later on that there was more tolerance, and so students became less racist and there was less hostility between student groups. And I believe the media have an extremely important responsibility here. Now, today there's something we often call the news bias. That means that bad news makes the news and good news does not make the news. And there's a number of psychological reasons for that. I mean, we're just much more prone to look out for bad news. Evolutionary, that was important. But a consequence is that when it comes to relation between groups, the kind of news we're getting on television, in the newspapers, is often news of tensions and conflict rising between different groups. What we do not hear or see much about are these increasingly frequent positive, constructive interactions between different groups, between different nations, between people of different groups. And this is problematic, this one-sided view on the world, which does not give actually an accurate picture of what is happening out there in the world, because it is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, when you talk or when you inform people about conflicts and hostility between groups, you make them more suspicious by doing so, which in turn fuels the conflict, fuels the suspicion between the different groups. When you show people all of the positive, constructive interaction happening over the borders of groups, it is also a positive self-fulfilling prophecy. You make people more open to other groups, more tolerant, and therefore you also fuel that process of better group relations. So the media, I believe, have an important responsibility, and it is not something that will easily be achieved, but some media are aware of this to also show and report on all the good things in the world, especially when it comes to relations between nations, groups, and so forth. And then finally, there's the importance of what is often called gentle commerce. Now, commerce is one of the driving forces of peaceful relations between nations, because on the one hand, it creates what they call a positive sum game. Both parties, both nations in this context, have profit by cooperating together, by having commercial ties and relations with each other. So this reduces the incentive for conflict between groups, but it also creates positive contacts between those groups. And this, as pointed out, is a major element that gets us to more solidarity over the borders of the groups, more cooperation over the borders of the group. And then finally, there's feminization. Now, violent conflict throughout human history has been almost exclusively a male pastime. There are some stories about medieval queens waging war and Amazonian females riding bare-chested on horses and conquering other groups with their bows and arrows. But in general, war has been started by men and has been waged, has been fought by men. And according to the evolutionary psychologist Van Vuchten, working at a Dutch university, this is actually, or this makes a lot of sense, because there is what he calls, what he framed as the male warrior hypothesis. And according to his hypothesis, or evolutionary history might be to blame for the fact that men are so easily tempted to engage in aggressive conflict with other groups, with men of other groups, with people of other groups. And the reason is because in the context of frequent group conflict in which we lived, those men who were willing to fight and perhaps die for the group, think about the bravehearts of this world, they got a lot of status in the group, and with that status came lots of reproductive opportunities. So the genes of those belligerent males, they spread profusely in the human gene pool. And so we see that in all cultures today, boys are much more likely to watch violent movies and to enjoy violent movies, for instance, than girls. And there's a number of different factors that just inside the typical male psychology, much more to be excited by the prospect of violent conflict and participating in violent conflict. And so we see that when women are given a prominent place in society, like has happened during the 20th century, that wave of feminization in Europe, and now in many parts of the rest of the world, we see when women are given a prominent place in society, that chances of violent conflict drop significantly. As Virginia Woolf has put it, and she does make a good point, war will not end as long as women are kept out of power. And so there is probably good evolutionary reasons why the male psychology, again, on average, this doesn't go for every individual, of course, is more belligerent than the female psychology. And according to Pinker, who you also read the text from who you also read the text in his great book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, well, he identifies these elements as extremely important elements that got us into what he calls an ongoing civilizing process from the late Middle Ages, in which group conflict was an extremely violent and common occurrence, to today, the most peaceful of all times here on Earth. And he says that after this late Middle Ages, well, there was more room and space for autonomous reasoning on morality and society, something which I've already pointed out, the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment. There was a rise of cosmopolitanism because of transport technology evolving. There was an incredible rise in international trades, creating this positive sum between nations, but also fostering positive contacts. And then later, during the 20th century in Europe, there was this wave of feminization that led to this ongoing civilizing process. And it is very much on this important trend that we have to continue today. We have to ensure quality education for all, not only because it is vitally important to address the problem of poverty, but also because it is vitally important to protect future and current generations against the otherwise very alluring stories that play in, or ideologies rather, sectarian ideologies that play into our innate tribalism. We also, as I pointed out, have to show these positive contacts and increasingly positive contacts between different groups, the responsibility of the media, because it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. We have to foster international trade, gentle commerce as much as we can, and we have to insist on women's rights in places where this is not already the case. But to get to global cooperation, we also need something that is called common knowledge of the intention to cooperate globally and common knowledge of the tasks that await each party that is involved in that cooperation. Now, common knowledge is a central feature to any cooperative endeavor. Now, what do I mean with common knowledge? Well, the best way to explain it is to compare it with shared knowledge. Now, shared knowledge is knowledge that is shared by different kind of people. They share some knowledge. But the crucial difference with common knowledge is that when you just have shared knowledge, well, that everybody knows something, but all the parties that know something do not know who else knows that something. Now, common knowledge is a situation in which everybody not only knows something, but also knows that everybody knows this something. Who else knows this something? Compare it with emails. Well, I can write a mail to all of you, but put you all in BCC. So you don't see who else got this mail. Then you will all have shared knowledge of the content of my mail. If I put you all in CC, well, then you will see who else received the mail, and you will have common knowledge of the content of that mail, because you will not only share the knowledge of what is written in that mail, but you also know who else has that knowledge and what exactly they will know. Now, as I said, common knowledge is a central feature of cooperation, because it only makes sense for an individual or a nation in the context of global cooperation to do his or her part in the cooperative activity if they can expect others to do their part as well. You need common knowledge of the motivation of others to do what is expected of them, and you also need common knowledge of what exactly the roles of everybody in that cooperative interaction or that cooperative endeavor is. Now, simple example, let's say that we make this plan to go clean up campus. We want to take a half day off, and we want to take all the trash out of campus. Now, if I'm going to do my part in this activity, well, I'm probably going to want some insurance that all of you, or at least most of you, will also show up and help me clean. If I can't expect that, if I expect there to be alone there, then I know I will never be able to clean the campus successfully. So all of my effort will be kind of wasted effort. I won't get very far in cleaning up the campus. So it doesn't make much sense for me to actually take the trouble and start cleaning. So I need common knowledge of your motivation to help me cleaning, and I need common knowledge of the fact that everybody knows what he or she is supposed to do. Perhaps some of us are going to brush, some of us are going to take litter bags, some of us are going to take the trash away. We all need to know what we have to do for the activity to actually yield fruit, for the cooperative endeavor to come to a good end. So we need common knowledge of that, otherwise it just doesn't make sense to kind of do the effort ourselves. Now, something very similar is the case when it comes to global cooperation. Think about climate change. Now, if, for instance, the United States do not expect that China or India will do any efforts to reduce carbon emission, well, it doesn't make that much sense for them to clean up their act, because they'll say, well, we'll suffer all of the economic short-term consequences of that, we'll bear the costs of reducing CO2 emission, while climate change is going to go unchanged because China and India are just putting more and more carbon CO2 in our atmosphere. So they will only be truly motivated to do so if they can expect, and if they do expect, all other nations, all other groups, all other parties involved to do their part in that cooperative activity as well, to do their part, in this case, in reducing greenhouse gas emission. And so there's a very important role of the media there. Now, common knowledge between all nations on earth was absolutely impossible, let's say 200 years ago, because there weren't the communication networks. But now today, obviously, with communication technology, we can communicate very easily, swiftly, and in real time over borders, across continents, and so forth. We have shared media outlets, and they could provide that crucial role of giving common knowledge about the intentions of all the parties involved and get us to global cooperation. There's also a very important role there of a global institution that kind of orchestrates this global cooperation and tries to protect it, but also informs everybody else that we know what is expected of each one, and we know that each of the parties involved know what they precisely have to do. And in the rest of today's lecture, I'll be talking about that global institution, because this is a central feature to get to proper global cooperation. So in order to cooperate globally, we need a global institution. And luckily, we possess such a global institution, the United Nations, and that is a historical step in the right direction. It is, in a way, our first answer, the first answer we've come up with in order to deal with the major challenge of our time, which is to cooperate globally. Now, the United Nations is an institution with much merit, not in the least because it fostered an era of unprecedented peace since the Second World War and kept relative peace on a global scale. Relative, of course, there have been conflicts, there are still conflicts, but still an unprecedented era of peace thanks to the peacekeeping efforts of the United Nations. It is also an institution that had an important role in reducing poverty during the 20th and the 21st century. So, an institution with a lot of merit. However, it often fails to deal with important global cooperation problems efficiently. And that is most prominently the case, I believe, when it comes to climate change. So far, the United Nations and other supranational institutions, such as the EU, have been having a very hard time to come up with strong and efficient global or supranational policy to deal with these cooperation problems, and so with climate change. We have to ask ourselves why that is the case, because that will be the starting point of asking ourselves how we could improve on that very important and vital global institution in order to come to an era of durable and efficient global cooperation. So this is very much a second part of the solutions, global solutions, and that is what we'll discuss next week.